Welcome back to Reform Thinking. Today, we're diving into the deep dive, where we take your sources, peel back the layers, and bring you the core insights, along with some surprising facts to get you truly well-informed. Our focus today is on a crucial topic with vast human and economic implications: Ukraine's reconstruction. You've brought us a comprehensive set of materials, and what's especially striking is how they outline a vision for economic renewal that's, well, grounded in a distinct theological framework.
Indeed. And our task for this deep dive is to unpack the sheer scale of the challenges Ukraine faces. We need to assess the innovative solutions being proposed and really understand how a distinct, reformed theological framework is presented as guiding these efforts. This isn't just about spreadsheets or, rebuilding bridges. It's about discerning how a nation can rebuild its physical and moral foundations from the ground up.
Okay, so how do we even begin to grasp the sheer scope of this national rebuilding effort? Where do we start?
Well, the sources make it very clear that the immediate reality is one of staggering devastation. The war has left just a vast economic scar on Ukraine. Think about this. A joint rapid damage and needs assessment released back in February 2025. This was put together by Kyiv, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the UN. They calculated a 10-year reconstruction bill at a truly staggering U.S. $524 billion.
524 billion, that figure is just immense. To put that into perspective for you, the sources tell us this amount is nearly 3 times Ukraine's expected 2024 economic output and almost triple its projected 2024 GDP. But the cost isn't just financial, is it? There's a profound human aspect here.
Oh, absolutely. Almost 2.5 million households have lost their homes. That's millions of families. And we're talking about between 3.6 to 3.8 million Ukrainians displaced internally, plus another 6.8 million in exile abroad.
That's led to a severely diminished labor pool, fractured families. It's a truly heart-wrenching loss.
It is. And the physical damage to critical infrastructure just keeps mounting. Energy facilities are the most severely impacted. The sources say there's been a 70% increase in damage since the previous assessment.
70%. That casts serious doubt on their ability to withstand the coming winter, doesn't it?
It really does. And the sources highlight the constant threat. They mention a July 3rd, 2025 attack on Odessa that destroyed newly rebuilt port transformers. And tragically, it resulted in worker fatalities. It's this constant battle against ongoing missile strikes where anything rebuilt is immediately threatened again.
So, despite these massive needs, is there any immediate financial relief being provided, or are they facing this completely on their own right now?
Well, there are efforts, certainly, but a significant gap remains. The 2025 state budget, for instance, it earmarked about US $7.37 billion for urgent repairs. But the sources indicate a financing gap of nearly US $10 billion still remains just for these immediate urgent repairs.
10 billion short just for the urgent stuff. That's a shortfall that needs to be addressed incredibly quickly.
Yes, it does.
That truly frames the immediate scale of the problem. But let's broaden our view a bit. What are the present multi-layered challenges facing Ukraine beyond just the physical damage we've discussed?
Right. Beyond the sheer physical destruction, a critical issue is the erosion of public trust and the ongoing fight against corruption. The sources describe an incident in late July 2025. President Zelensky apparently backed a bill trying to reduce the independence of key anti-corruption bodies. We're talking about AMBU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and SAPO, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office.
That sounds problematic, especially now.
It was. It prompted street protests and a pretty stark warning from Brussels about potentially freezing $3 billion in funding.
This whole episode really shows that righteous governance isn't just some moral aspiration. It's a practical gatekeeper of solvency for a nation relying on foreign capital and public trust.
That's a crucial point. Connecting governance directly to financial stability and the flow of international aid. What about the physical flow of goods and resources within the country? How is that faring? Supply chains are severely constricted. Ukraine, which was once a huge global grain exporter, well, now its grain production has fallen 29% below its 5-year average.
29%? That's a massive drop.
It is, and consecutive strikes on the Black Sea and lower Danube terminals have severely cut insured vessel calls, which creates these huge logistical bottlenecks. Even rail diversions are limited by locomotive shortages and, the different track gauges between Ukraine and its neighbors.
Yeah.
It causes inland storage pileups and really depresses farm prices just when farmers need capital the most to reseed.
So it hits hard at the very foundation of their agricultural economy. And what about the human element of this crisis? How has this conflict shaped the minds and choices of the Ukrainian people themselves, particularly regarding migration?
Yeah, the impact on, let's call it the human psyche and migratory choices, presents a really serious hurdle. Clinical surveys indicate post-traumatic stress in nearly 30% of adult refugees.
30%. That's almost 1 in 3.
Yes. And children. Children haven't experienced a single siren-free semester. Think about that. Constant disruption, fear, a fractured education. The sources warn the country faces the risk of a burnout generation if psychological and educational aid aren't deeply integrated into reconstruction efforts.
And the population numbers reflect this drain, don't they?
Drastically. Ukraine's population has fallen from about 53 million back in 1992 to barely 31 million living under Kyiv's flag in 2023. And this is compounded by having the world's lowest birth rate, which points towards a looming demographic crisis.
On that note, the sources also highlight damage to educational and cultural infrastructure. Over 3,373 schools damaged, 385 of them completely leveled. The replacement cost is over US $13 billion. And cultural monuments scarred, too, representing a deep wound to national identity.
They certainly are. As the sources put it, the nation's most important capital soul, shaped by truth, beauty, and covenant family, is declining.
So, given these truly daunting realities, the devastation, the governance challenges, the human toll, how do the sources propose a vision of hope and sober-minded stewardship? What's the guiding philosophy here?
It's interesting. The sources frame reconstruction as starting with Christian hope.
Mm-hmm.
But this hope isn't based on, wishful thinking amidst destruction. It's grounded in the absolute sovereignty of God, who, as Psalm 24.1 states, owns the earth in its fullness.
Okay.
So this perspective views economic recovery as, and I quote, covenantal before it is technical. It calls for righteous rulers, industrious citizens, and community welfare, drawing directly on biblical instruction.
So it's not simply about repairing what's broken. It's about recommissioning every aspect of society with a renewed sense of purpose under God.
Precisely. It's a call to sober-minded stewardship, to clear the rubble, yes, but also to reinforce honest institutions and recommission every sector to work under God's blessing. The ultimate aim presented is that this reconstruction is seen not just as an economic program, but as a public witness to the gospel's ability to rebuild what has been destroyed, like a living parable of resurrection grace.
That brings us neatly to the core theological principles guiding this vision for rebuilding. Let's start with the idea of God's sovereignty and common grace. How do these, fairly abstract ideas specifically shape the reconstruction blueprint on the ground?
Right, they might seem abstract, but they're foundational here. God's absolute sovereignty means humans are stewards of his creation, not its ultimate owners. The sources keep coming back to Psalm 24.1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. It reminds planners they're managing another state, if you will.
Like a trusted manager.
Exactly. And flowing from this is the concept of common grace.
Yeah.
This is the idea that God bestows skills, ideas, natural resources on all people, regardless of their belief. This doctrine is seen as liberating Ukraine to use secular skills, foreign capital, cutting-edge technology, without compromising its spiritual identity. Why? Because all good gifts originate from God. It means they can partner with anyone who brings good gifts to the table.
That's a powerful point of integration, allowing for practical solutions without sacrificing spiritual conviction. How does this connect to governance within this framework?
Well, the magistrate, or the governing authority, has a Romans 13 mandate to reward good and punish evil. So this means honest courts, transparent procurement, diligent policing. These aren't just bureaucratic tasks. They're seen as liturgical acts of obedience, acknowledging Christ's rule. The sources argue the very first building block of economic renewal is moral. Re-enthrone righteousness in public life so common grace can flow unimpeded. It's about creating fertile ground.
Okay, so from God's sovereignty, we move to the anthropology of the imago Dei, the image of God in humanity. How does recognizing human dignity guide economic policy in this framework?
Humans, created in God's image, are commanded to fill the earth and subdue it. That's the cultural mandate from Genesis 1.28. This command gives dignity to all lawful labor, whether it's driving tractors or writing code. This viewpoint refuses to see displaced persons, widows, or veterans as mere liabilities or just, human capital to be managed.
Right.
Instead, it sees them as artisans-in-waiting, whose latent creativity can be summoned forth, bringing beauty and productivity even from brokenness.
That reframes a challenge into an opportunity for human potential. Seeing individuals as contributors, not just recipients, what are the practical policy implications of this vision then?
Policies should aim to liberate initiative. Things like clear property rights, low barriers for small firms to enter the market, vocational training that's accessible to the poor, and welfare programs that focus on rehabilitation rather than just continuous subsidy. The goal is always moving individuals closer to self-governing productivity because, as the sources put it, productivity is worship in overalls. Every act of honest work is potentially an act of worship.
It sounds like a clear rejection of a purely technocratic approach to human potential. Next, let's explore Abraham Kuyper's concept of covenantal sphere sovereignty. How does this shape society's reconstruction, particularly in a post-conflict environment?
Kuyper. Yes, sphere sovereignty describes society as composed of distinct coordinate jurisdictions: family, church, state, market, school, guild, and so on, each operating directly under God, and therefore they shouldn't be merged or have one dominate the others.
Okay, so distinct spheres.
Right. And this principle guards against two common problems in post-conflict nations: anarchic fragmentation, where everything falls apart, and Leviathan centralism, which is basically state overreach. The war necessarily concentrated authority in Kyiv. Peace, this view suggests, must now disperse it back to its proper spheres.
Can you give us some practical examples of how this plays out in the Ukrainian context?
Sure. Municipalities, for example, should manage local street repairs. They're closest to the problem. Church-based NGOs might deliver trauma counseling more effectively, with more cultural sensitivity than some centralized ministry. Family farms need secure land titles, free from oligarchic encroachment, allowing them to truly own and work their land. The state enforces contracts, defends borders. The church proclaims the gospel, instructs conscience. The family nurtures generational capital. Businesses create goods and jobs. It provides essential checks and balances, preventing one sphere from expanding beyond its charter and sort of swallowing up its neighbors. It helps build a more robust society.
That's a very clear division of labor for the various parts of society. Finally, in this section, let's discuss vocation and Sabbath economics. How do work and rest balance in this reconstruction vision, especially when there's just so much urgent work to do?
That's a key tension, isn't it? The Reformed doctrine of vocation teaches that all lawful labor is priestly service. So Ukrainians rebuilding power lines or cultivating demined fields are, in this view, engaged in service to God. However, and this is crucial, this vocational zeal is balanced with creational limits, especially the Sabbath principle of rest, which comes right from Genesis 2, where God himself rested. It's a rhythm built into creation.
So what does that mean for real-world policy applications? How can rest actually be legislated or encouraged?
Well, policy should guarantee a weekly rest day. They should encourage family time and actively discourage those 247 work cycles. These are seen as scaffolding for humane, sustainable productivity. The sources also mention drawing inspiration from gleaning laws and jubilee patterns from the Old Testament.
Gleaning and jubilee, how does that translate?
It suggests that markets should be, let's say, girded by mercy. Things like microcredit for startups, bankruptcy rules that temper debt slavery, preventing people from being crushed by debt. Social safety nets designed to preserve households, not just individuals. This whole approach aims to energize reconstruction while guarding against burnout or harmful exploitative capitalism. It tries to inoculate the effort against idolatrous overwork or predatory practices.
Okay, moving from those theological foundations to the practicalities of governance. Strengthening anti-corruption bodies is identified as a cornerstone of this reconstruction effort. Given Ukraine's history, what makes this so critical right now?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. The sources point back to that July 2025 incident we mentioned, where President Zelensky backed a bill threatening the independence of DBU and CPO. The resulting protests and the warning from Brussels about freezing $3 billion in funding really hammered home the point. Righteous governance isn't some optional extra. It's the gatekeeper of solvency, especially when you rely on foreign capital. Without it, trust with international partners just evaporates.
So what are the specific recommendations to ensure these bodies maintain their independence and effectiveness, especially when political pressures inevitably arise?
The main things are constitutionally entrenching AMEU and CPO independence, ensuring merit-based appointments for their chiefs, and publishing their budgets quarterly for full transparency. Beyond that, there's a big push for procurement reform. Public procurement should transition from paper trails to tamper-proof code.
Tamper-proof code, how does that work?
It involves integrating Ukraine's existing Prozoro marketplace, their electronic public procurement system, with blockchain technology. The idea is to trace funds transparently, all the way from the donor to the final recipient. It makes graft much harder to hide, ideally deterring it before it starts. These reforms are framed as liturgical acts of repentance, swapping unjust measures for honest ones, pleasing God and inviting common grace, you see.
Right. Another critical aspect of righteous governance mentioned is the restitution of property and clear title. How does the war complicate this, and what solutions are proposed to bring clarity and security to property ownership?
Well, the war has displaced millions and damaged land registry offices, the cadastral offices. This creates a kind of fog where opportunities for land grabs and bureaucratic rent-seeking can thrive. While new rules in March 2025 streamlined electronic title searches, the sources say backlogs persist for months, leaving many people uncertain about their ownership. The sources reference biblical precedents here, like Exodus 22 and Nehemiah 5, which talk about restoring stolen property and ensuring fair land distribution.
So, how can those biblical patterns be applied today, especially using modern technology?
The proposals include launching fast-track restitution courts in every oblast, staffed by judges from less affected regions and supervised by international observers to ensure impartiality, and, technologically, implementing digital twins of deeds.
Digital twins.
Yeah, essentially creating an unalterable, cryptographically secure digital copy of every land title. It would be hashed, time-stamped, and stored across redundant servers. This anchors a national cadastre that's immune to arson or cyber attack. Think of it as an unhackable, unburnable, universally verifiable digital ID for every piece of land.
That sounds incredibly secure.
It's meant to be.
Yeah.
Plus, compensation funds, partly financed by those frozen Russian assets we discussed, could issue tradable restoration bonds for buildings damaged beyond repair. This aims to restore economic agency and boost confidence for investors. If they see enforceable title, they're more likely to invest.
This brings us to subsidiarity and decentralization. How does the principle of local authority play into effective governance for reconstruction?
Subsidiarity basically means authority should be exercised as close to the problem as possible. While some tax powers were transferred down to the Ramadas, the municipalities, starting back in 2014, martial law understandably re-centralized many decisions. The reform proposed is for the government to complete that decentralization process. This would involve transforming local state administrations into prefectures accountable to elected councils and EU-style art chambers. It pushes decision-making and accountability closer to the people affected.
How would international donors support this decentralization effort? It sounds good in principle, but how do you make it work?
Donors can reinforce it by routing a fixed share. The example given is 30% of reconstruction grants directly to transparent municipalities. Municipalities that publish their contracts on Prosoro and undergo civil society audits. Churches and local NGOs, who are often already trusted as aid hubs, could serve as volunteer monitors, keeping an eye on how funds are spent locally. This aims to fertilize social capital, making citizens more willing to pay taxes and comply when they see tangible results in their own communities. It multiplies state capacity without coercion.
Finally, let's discuss the proposed ethical fiscal framework. What measures are suggested for responsible financial management looking towards the long term?
The framework proposes legislating a medium-term debt anchor. For example, capping public debt at 60% of GDP by 2032. This is explicitly grounded in the Mosaic admonition against deficit borrowing from future generations. That's Deuteronomy 15, and the Pauline call to owe no one anything, from Romans 13.8.
Interesting biblical grounding for fiscal policy. What other measures?
Migrating all quasi-fiscal operations, that's government-like spending, happening outside the regular budget, onto the Treasury's single account for full visibility. Ministries must also publish financial statements compliant with International Public Sector Accounting Standards, IPSAS, for transparency. This allows investors and taxpayers to see the true state of the nation's finances.
And there's even a symbolic reform mentioned, a nod to this theological grounding.
Yes, resurrecting the pre-war plan to engrave Psalm 101.6. I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, on the annual budget cover. It serves as a constant reminder to legislators that balance sheets, just like thrones, are ultimately secured by righteousness. When fraud is punished, property protected, local authorities empowered, and the books are honest, that's when the moral scaffolding of the economy is truly rebuilt.
With that governance framework hopefully being put in place, let's turn our attention to the priority sectors for economic renewal. And as the sources put it, nothing works without light and heat. So let's start with energy sector resilience. What's the vision for rebuilding Ukraine's energy infrastructure?
Yeah, they mean that quite literally. The EU has earmarked $265 million specifically for stabilizing Ukraine's crippled grid. Things like replacing scorched transformers, pre-positioning mobile gas turbines for emergencies. But the central idea here is decentralization, a rapid build-out of rooftop solar and battery storage.
Okay, so moving away from big central power plants.
To some extent, yes. The vision is for a lattice of microgrids. These can spread risk and keep essential services like hospitals and water pumps running even during attacks. It makes the whole system less vulnerable than relying on a few easily targeted central nodes.
That's a smart strategy for security, decentralizing the risk. What's the long-range vision for this approach?
The goal is that by 2028, maybe a tenth of national capacity could come from such community-scale renewables. This would help insulate the economy from both external threats and, frankly, oligarchic monopolies in the energy sector. The sources also mention a neat, practical theological application. Seminary annexes are piloting electrician certificates. They're pairing training on solar panel installation with work as worship courses. So it's not just technical skill, it's viewing the repair of the grid as faithful service.
Interesting. Beyond energy, Ukraine has always been a major player in global food production. What's the plan for agricultural vitality, especially with the current disruptions?
Well, as we said, grain output has fallen sharply, 29% below the 5-year average. And port strikes keep worsening the global food price situation. So policies are proposed to cushion farmers without creating dependency. This includes things like risk-sharing crop insurance, capitalized by donor funds, confessional credit, basically, loans of very favorable terms to rebuild damaged combines and equipment, helping farmers get back on their feet quickly without crushing debt, and fast-tracking rail links to the Danube to bypass those missile-threatened Black Sea roads.
And are there community models that integrate the theological vision here, like we saw in the energy sector?
Yes. The sources suggest agrarian cooperatives managed on Christian bylaws. These could incorporate principles like shared machinery, mandated Sabbath rest for workers and land, and profit tithes set aside for widows and orphans in the community. This offers a model of productivity married to mercy, ensuring economic activity also supports the most vulnerable. The underlying idea is that when farmers have secure title deeds and reliable export corridors, they sow with hope. And transparent pricing draws foreign traders, multiplying liquidity through trust.
Next up, small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, often called the backbone of an economy, but they're particularly vulnerable during wartime, especially finding credit. How are they being supported?
They are indeed very vulnerable. The sources note that on July 10, 2025, the European Investment Bank announced almost $600 million in fresh financing specifically for Ukrainian firms. Half of that is in loan guarantees, the other half in direct credit. The sources also suggest contributions from the state and the church.
How would that work?
The state could offer something like a 5-year tax holiday for family-run firms under 50 employees, provided they reinvest, say, at least 80% of their profit back into the business. And microloan funds from churches and diaspora philanthropies could specifically target veteran and widow-led ventures.
So using existing community structures for support.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And the sources even suggest that community elders who might already be mentoring mayors on integrity could sit on local loan committees. The idea is to blend financial prudence with grace, ensuring patronage doesn't eclipse merit. Credit, in this view, isn't just a transaction, it's a seedbed for generosity, aligning with the biblical idea of having something to share. A loan helps someone become productive so they can be generous in turn.
Finally, let's talk about digital and cyber infrastructure. Ukraine has shown remarkable technological resilience during the war, particularly with its DIA platform. What are the future priorities for safeguarding and building on this digital strength?
Yeah, the DIA platform is highlighted as a global model of crisis governance. It kept essential services flowing, even when city halls were literally in rubble. However, vulnerabilities exist. The sources mentioned the July 2025 Starlink blackout, which briefly throttled satellite coverage over frontline zones. That exposed the fragility of relying too heavily on single-vendor systems.
So what are the priorities going forward?
Building redundant fiber optic corridors through neighboring countries for resilience, establishing sovereign cloud centers, hardened against both physical missile attacks and cyber intrusions, and developing open-source alternatives to avoid dependence on single commercial vendors.
How does the theological perspective, particularly common grace and sphere sovereignty, inform this highly technical area?
Well, common grace legitimizes collaboration with the best secular engineers because all good gifts, including technical skill, originate from God. So they should work with the brightest minds available, regardless of background. But sphere sovereignty provides a caution against ceding critical national infrastructure to unaccountable tech giants. So public funds should purchase open license code, allowing local developers to modify and secure applications without needing proprietary permission, and require transparent audit trails. Vocational boot camps can train a new generation of cyber gatekeepers, combining IT skills with biblical wisdom, viewing firewalls, maybe, as an expression of loving your neighbor in the digital realm.
So, an overarching principle across all four sectors seems to be that capital must never outrun character. What
Yeah.
does that truly signify in this context?
It signifies that while you can rebuild energy grids in a couple of construction seasons, rebuilding trust takes generations. Grain silos might go up by next harvest, but honest scales are carved in human hearts. Loans can travel at fiber optic speed, yet the ethical code that ensures they're repaid grows slowly, like an oak tree. Each macroeconomic intervention discussed here carries a micro-discipleship analog. It's about consciously building moral foundations alongside the physical ones.
Okay, the sources refer to the church and wider civil society as the operating system for reconstruction. What does that signify, and what crucial role do they play in a nation's rebuilding, according to this view?
It's a powerful metaphor. If the bulldozers and the balance sheets are the hardware of reconstruction, then the church and civil society supply the operating system, the underlying values, trust, and relationships without which even the finest machinery solves. The sources look back to Acts 6, where the early church addressed a food security crisis by appointing spirit-filled deacons, weaving mercy and accountability into the city's social fabric. And Jeremiah 29:7 commands the exiles to seek the welfare of the city where they live. These texts suggest a kind of twin logic for post-war Ukraine. While the state wields the sword and donors provide capital, covenant communities, churches, families, local groups must disciple consciences, bind up wounds, and model honesty so the public trust, which has been shredded by both shelling and corruption, can grow back stronger.
Let's start with trauma care, which you mentioned is a dire need given the human cost. What's the church's unique role here, especially where other resources might be scarce or less trusted?
Right, we talked about the high PTSD rates, maybe 1/3 of returning combatants, and high depression among displaced mothers. Imagine the silent battles being fought in homes across the country, long after the physical shelling stops. Government clinics are often scarce, and secular therapy can sometimes carry a stigma. Local congregations, however, have arguably the densest grassroots networks in the country. They're already present in communities. So pastoral counseling teams can be trained apparently at comparatively low cost in things like basic narrative exposure therapy, biblical lament practices, and suicide prevention protocols.
And this leads to the idea of grace and resilience centers. Can you tell us more about those?
Yes, these are proposed church-hosted centers, places offering walk-in counseling, peer-led support groups, maybe guided sessions using the Psalms for lament. Crucially, partnering with licensed Christian psychiatrists where needed. This approach amplifies public health efforts by providing the physical rooms, the existing rapport within the community, and a framework of hope. It ensures shattered souls can begin the work of rebuilding shattered cities. It's spiritual and emotional first aid alongside the physical.
Another critical area is workforce formation and ethical entrepreneurship. How does Reformed theology connect to daily work in this context, and what practical initiatives emerge from that connection?
Well, as we touched on with vocation, Reformed theology sees all lawful labor, welding, coding, bookkeeping, whatever, as potentially priestly service when offered to God. It shatters that old sacred-secular divide. So congregations can naturally run practical evening job skill labs right in their church basements. Things like resume clinics, language lessons may be focused on export sales, crash courses on tax compliance, workshops on biblical work ethic.
So practical skills mixed with ethical foundations, providing a holistic approach to livelihood.
Precisely. You could have business elders mentoring startups funded by those microloans we discussed.
Yeah.
Integrating Proverbs on honest scales right alongside QuickBooks tutorials on double entry ledgers. Partnerships with technical colleges could multiply the reach. The example given is a seminary hosting a joint program on the book of Galatians and solar panel installation. These initiatives aim to turn relief recipients into producers, fostering integrity within a relational network. Graduates carry not just skills, but a community network that can vouch for their character.
This leads naturally to the idea of integrity networks, establishing a moral foundation in public life. How would this work on a broader scale, beyond individual businesses or job skills?
The idea is that systematic discipleship can turn private faith into public courage, especially for civil servants facing temptations. Regional pastors' groups could, for instance, meet monthly with local officials, mayors, administrators, not to lobby necessarily, but to ask about the temptations towards compromise they face, maybe echoing John the Baptist's counsel to tax collectors and soldiers, just offering support and accountability. Meanwhile, Christian lawyers could staff pro bono whistleblower advocacy desks.
Whistleblower desks?
Yeah, assuring civil servants that they'll be supported legally and spiritually if they expose graft, providing a shield for those who do the right thing.
So these are efforts to cultivate conscience where legislation alone might fall short, providing both spiritual and legal backing for doing what is right.
That's the aim. These relational ligaments, as the sources call them, don't replace formal anti-corruption agencies, but they strengthen them by cultivating the one variable legislation can't coerce, which is conscience. It's building a culture of integrity from the ground up.
The war has undoubtedly created societal divisions and deep wounds. How can the church contribute to reconciliation ministries, which seem vital for true national healing?
This is a really unique function. While war crimes tribunals provide essential justice, they cannot by themselves grant forgiveness or heal relationships. Here, the church offers a ministry of confession and absolution, grounded in the gospel. Practically, this could look like facilitated dialogues pairing veterans from the Donbass trenches with church members from Western regions, helping to reduce mutual suspicion. Or liturgies of lament held on massacre anniversaries, allowing communities to mourn together without seeking cyclical vengeance, moving towards healing rather than just retribution.
And the gospel's role here in unifying such a diverse and traumatized population.
The gospel message itself stating Christ is our peace, who has made us both one, places ultimate identity not in your region, your language, or your particular church tradition, but in a new humanity found in Him. This unifying power is seen as reducing political risk and encouraging long-term investment because it helps stitch together regions, ethnicities, and denominational tribes that Russian disinformation has actively tried to tear apart.
Finally, let's look at civil society coalitions as allies in this effort. How does this vision bring together various non-state actors for the common good?
The sources encourage viewing other groups, NGOs, agricultural cooperatives, student unions as allies through that Cooperian lens we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Seeing each sphere as a distinct ordinance operating under Christ's overall supremacy, they're partners, not rivals. So churches could host town hall forums where NGOs present budget monitoring apps they've developed, where journalists explain investigative methods, where municipal officers answer tough questions from citizens. This symbolizes, as the sources say, reknitting the covenant between ruler and ruled. This synergy between spiritual authority and civic initiative is seen as vital. It ensures donor funds reach living tissue, microloans get repaid, and traumatized families find rest. Because, as Jeremiah said, in the city's welfare, you find your own welfare.
Mobilizing the necessary funds for Ukraine's reconstruction is obviously a colossal task. Let's start with the aggressor pays principle and the proposed funding mechanisms. How is justice being integrated into this international finance framework?
Right, the financing discussion begins with that principle. The aggressor should pay for what violence has stolen. This aligns with biblical calls for restitution. Exodus 22 is cited in justice, as in Proverbs 21.3. A key mechanism here is the G7's agreement back in June 2024 for a U.S. $50 billion Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan, or ERA loan.
Okay, the ERA loan, how is that funded?
It's serviced by the interest earned from approximately U.S. $280 billion into mobilized Russian sovereign reserves held in the West. Washington disbursed an initial U.S. $20 billion tranche in December 2024.
And how would Kiev utilize these interest flows to serve the people of Ukraine directly?
The recommendation is that Kyiv should channel these interest flows into a dedicated reparations fund. This fund would prioritize restitution for homes and businesses destroyed after February 24, 2022. And critically, all payouts from this fund would be published on a tamper-proof ledger for full transparency. This arrangement is seen as satisfying both the civil responsibility of magistrate to bear the sword against wrongdoing, that's Romans 13, and the principle of justice, Proverbs 21.3, while also reducing the burden on donor taxpayers, which could help prevent donor fatigue down the line.
Beyond that specific fund, how does the concept of performance-based aid ensure accountability and make sure funds are used effectively?
The idea is that grants and loans should be linked to performance outcomes, to cultivate virtue, as well as just providing liquidity. The EU's $50 billion Ukraine facility for 2024-27 already does this to some extent, linking tranches to quarterly reform indicators, things like hitting macro stability targets or meeting anti-corruption benchmarks for NAB-EU and SAPO. The World Bank's cash-on-delivery loans, also known as Program for Results, take this logic even further. They reimburse ministries only after tangible outputs are completed and verified, like rebuilt roads or connected renewable energy megawatts.
So funds are tied directly to tangible results, preventing waste and fostering good stewardship.
Exactly. The suggestion is that Ukraine should embed all its bilateral aid within these kinds of measurable result matrices, assessed by independent auditors and civil society panels. This ensures funds either produce concrete outputs or they revert back to the giver. It's framed as covenantal accountability, turning money into moral instruction, teaching officials and citizens that blessings tend to follow obedience, echoing the parable of the talents.
Investors naturally have huge concerns about capital loss in a conflict zone. How are war risk insurance and credit guarantees being used to address these fears and encourage private investment?
Yeah, this is indispensable. You need a layered architecture of war risk insurance and credit guarantees to calm investor fears about losing capital due to conflict or legal instability. In July 2025, the International Finance Corporation, IFC, announced new initiatives, including a dedicated war risk pool specifically to attract private debt and equity for Ukrainian SMEs and energy projects. MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, has already provided over US $185 million in new political risk guarantees, mainly focused on agriculture and small business lending.
And other international bodies are contributing too, beyond the IFC and MIGA.
Yes. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, has underwritten over US $1 billion in war risk insurance and approved an additional US $325 million in fiscal year 2025 just for grain export infrastructure. And the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, unveiled a $110 million reinsurance guarantee to support inland cargo movement. That signals to private reinsurers that they can re-enter the market without taking on existential levels of risk. All these backstops are designed to convert, as the sources put it, fearful capital into venture capital. It acts out that principle from Deuteronomy 15, where covenant lenders are told to open their hands wide even during times of risk, ensuring generosity continues.
Finally, in this section, let's look at diverse partnerships. How does this vision allow Ukraine to collaborate beyond maybe shared worldviews, engaging with a wide array of international players?
The principle of common grace, again, frees Ukraine to partner with diverse nations and institutions. Think Turkey, Gulf sovereign funds, Japan, and others. As long as the alliance benefits the welfare of the city, Jeremiah 29.7, and maintains transparent procurement and moral witness, it's seen as legitimate. The recommendation is for Ukraine to create an open data investment platform. This would list shovel-ready projects already screened for legal compliance and ESG safeguards. This makes it easier to facilitate co-financing from various international investors, whether they're Muslim, secular, or Hindu, allowing them to potentially co-finance alongside, say, Baptist deacons or Dutch pension funds.
This sounds like a comprehensive approach to funding and collaboration, designed to bring in capital from every possible source while trying to maintain integrity.
It is, and it honors sphere sovereignty, allowing the state to regulate, the church to disciple, and the market to invest, each in its own sphere. The hoped-for result is a financing mosaic that leads to enrichment for the nation rather than corruption.
Beyond the physical and economic damage, the sources highlight a deeper wound: the damage to Ukraine's cultural and demographic fabric. What does this involve, and how do they plan to address it?
Yes, this is critical for any kind of lasting recovery. We mentioned the school situation. Over 3,300 damaged, hundreds leveled, costing over $13 billion to replace. Only a quarter of pupils can attend full-time classes. That's a massive hit to the nation's intellectual foundation. And the demographic numbers are stark. The world's lowest birth rate, population down potentially 20 million since independence.
And the cultural monuments, those irreplaceable symbols of national identity.
Scarred. This has prompted EU initiatives like a 50 million Team Europe Heritage Initiative and a Ukrainian Heritage Fund dedicated to rescue and restoration. All these statistics tell a single story. Ukraine's most precious capital souls shaped by truth, beauty, and covenant family is declining. Therefore, a reformed theology of culture moves cultural renewal and human capital recovery right to the front of the policy queue. It recognizes the nation can't thrive on just turbines and tax codes alone.
So how does public theology work to cultivate hope and foster a sense of national purpose in this context?
Public theology needs to dramatize Psalm 90.17, establish the work of our hands, make the connection between faith and rebuilding visible. This could be done through things like national days of prayer and thanksgiving, broadcasts from rebuilt churches out to frontline chapels. A presidential decree could even set 4 annual observances, maybe Liberation Day, Planting Day, Harvest Day, Advent Fast. On these days, schools could host communal liturgies of lament and gratitude, inviting participation from various faiths.
So these are rituals meant to anchor civic morale and unify the nation across different lines.
Exactly. And they reinforce sphere sovereignty. The state declares a holiday, while local congregations script the liturgy and families feast at home. Because hope is a form of social capital, these rhythms are seen as translating directly into productivity. Workers who believe their labor contributes to a redemptive drama might endure difficult tasks with more resilient joy. They work not just for a paycheck, but for a larger purpose.
This sounds like rebuilding the intellectual and creative foundations for the future. What about education and the arts specifically as incubators for this renewal?
Well, for education, emergency prefab classrooms can reopen schooling quickly. But war has also disrupted how teaching happens. The World Bank's Learning and School Resilience Project is already funding digital platforms that beam lessons into cellars during air raids. Churches can lend their parish halls as hybrid learning hubs, maybe pairing catechism with coding classes. For higher education, the idea of a 3-2 global semester model is proposed 3 semesters in Ukraine, 2 abroad. This helps bind the diaspora brain trust back to domestic faculties, reconnecting talent.
And for the arts, beyond just restoration of buildings,
EU heritage grants can underwrite restoring cultural institutions like the Kyiv National Conservatory, and finance traveling exhibitions maybe from Odessa's opera archives out to frontline towns. It echoes Isaiah 61.3, giving beauty for ashes. The 2025 Kyiv Biennial, planned as a multi-city event, offers a deadline to reopen at least 5 bomb-damaged galleries as proof-of-concept studios. This signals that culture not only survives, but actively interprets the meaning of the war. That violins sounding in Luhansk or bronze foundries casting public sculpture in Kharkiv do more than just delight tourists. They speak of resilience and even resurrection.
given the demographic crisis and that lowest birth rate, what family-strengthening policies are proposed to encourage repatriation and new births?
To combat population collapse, the state could pair a 10-year income tax rebate with a substantial U.S. $10,000 welcome home grant for each newborn whose parents repatriate within 12 months. This could be funded from the interest income of the reparations fund. Labor law should guarantee a shared 6-month parental leave pool, flexible for either parent to use. Affordable maternity housing, maybe renovating old Soviet dormitories managed by church NGO consortia, could help cut urban child-rearing costs.
And tax credits for children, how would those be structured to encourage families?
Streamlined child tax credits should become a single refundable allowance that actually rises with birth order. This echoes Psalm 127's view of children as an inheritance and directly incentivizes larger families while supporting parents financially.
Finally, the rule of Sabbath for national recovery. How does this shape sustainable work rhythms in a nation that must feel immense pressure to work around the clock to rebuild?
That's the danger, isn't it? War's adrenaline can tempt leaders into pushing for 247 reconstruction schedules. But the Sabbath principle from Exodus 20 links productivity to rhythm, not just frenzy. It's presented as part of creational design for human flourishing. So, amending the labor code to cap the standard work week at, say, 40 hours, with double pay required for any Sabbath labor certified as a true emergency, would guard against burnout. It also signals to investors that Ukraine values sustainable output over heroic but ultimately brittle surges.
Are there economic incentives proposed for businesses to actually adopt this Sabbath rest?
Yes. Employers adopting Sabbath rest could receive a small payroll tax discount, maybe 2%. This could be financed by potentially lower health insurance payouts as occupational stress declines. Churches reinforce this pattern by offering Sunday community meals and free medical checkups, turning rest into relational oxygen, not just downtime. These policies entwining public liturgy, resilient education, pro-family economics, and creational rest aim to ensure Ukraine rebuilds not just as a rewired grid or a reopened port, but as a people whose minds have tasted beauty, whose children play in safe schools, whose families feast and multiply, and whose labor hums to a sustainable, perhaps even heavenly rhythm.
This is an incredibly comprehensive plan, but it needs a clear way to measure progress and ensure accountability. What kind of rigorous dashboard and key performance indicators, KPIs, are envisioned to track this immense effort?
Right. Accountability is key. Ukraine's recovery plan uses a rigorous dashboard with KPIs across 3 main clusters: governance, economic output, and social resilience. Each of these is tied to dated milestones and is buffered by an explicit risk management grid. It's designed to be as rigorous as any fiscal ledger and, ideally, as honest as the profit scales.
Let's start with governance metrics, which you've stressed are absolutely foundational. How will they track the fight against corruption?
Indeed. As Proverbs teaches, a throne is secured by righteousness. Ukraine's 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI score, was 35 out of 100, ranking 105th worldwide, not great. The Reconstruction Charter targets lifting that score to 50 out of 100 by 2030. That's a level comparable to Croatia's when it joined the EU. Achieving this involves those steps we discussed: constitutional entrenchment of NABU and SAPO independence, mandatory blockchain publication of large contracts above US 100K, and annual peer review audits by anti-graft agencies from places like Poland and Lithuania.
And what happens if these targets aren't met? Is there a built-in consequence to ensure compliance?
Yes, there are intermediate checkpoints. Aiming for a CPI of 40 by 2026, 45 by 2028. Failure to meet any waypoint automatically freezes 10% of donor-financed discretionary spending until corrective legislation is passed. There is also a metric tracking local fund transparency. At least 30% of donor tranches must flow directly to municipalities that publish itemized quarterly statements. If a locality misses 2 successive filings, its allocation automatically diverts to a compliant neighboring Hermata. It's a built-in incentive system to decentralize virtue and reward accountability.
Moving to economic milestones, what are the GDP targets for national economic recovery?
The plan targets the return to the pre-war real GDP level, which was about US $199.8 billion by the year 2030, and then reaching US $250 billion by 2035, with intermediate way stations of US $165 billion in 2027 and US $185 billion in 2029. This requires a sustained period of pretty rapid growth.
What are some of the specific sub-metrics within that for key sectors like energy and agriculture?
Okay, for energy reliability, decentralized renewables must supply 15% of electricity by winter 2027 and 25% by 2030. Nationwide outage hours should fall below 8 hours a year. For agricultural vitality, the Black Sea and Danube export channels need to achieve 90% operational days per quarter by 2028. If they fall below 70%, it triggers an automatic insurance premium subsidy to keep ships sailing. Manufacturing resilience. Commercial bank credit to SMEs needs to reach US $4 billion a year by 2027, backed by those IFC and MIGA guarantees. And finally, fiscal health. Sovereign debt capped at 60% of GDP by 2032, with an annual debt sustainability report tabled in Parliament.
Beyond the economic numbers, how will social resilience indicators ensure that rising graphs reflect truly healed people and communities?
That's crucial. Peer-reviewed surveys showed probable PTSD in roughly 29% of refugees and displaced adults. By 2028, the Ministry of Health, partnering with those church-run grace and resilience centers, must provide evidence-based trauma care to at least 70% of identified cases. This would be benchmarked through anonymized national screenings. And every oblast should host at least one certified counseling center per 150,000 residents by 2026, scaling up to 1 per 100,000 by 2030.
And what about the demographic challenges we discussed earlier, like the extremely low birth rate?
The live birth rate, currently the world's lowest at 7.9 per 1,000 population in 2024, needs to climb to 10 per 1,000 by 2032. Propelled by that refundable child tax credit that rises with birth order, and a welcome home grant for repatriating families, education recovery is tracked through classroom presence. By September 2027, 85% of pupils should attend in-person classes at least 4 days a week. That's up from barely 25% today in missile-threatened regions. It's about restoring a normal rhythm to childhood.
This sounds incredibly detailed, with clear lines of accountability built in. How does the plan account for and mitigate the key risks that could potentially derail all these efforts?
Good question. An updated risk register reviewed quarterly by the National Recovery Council identifies 5 dominant hazards and their mitigation strategies. First, military relapse like fresh missile waves, that's mitigated by layered air defenses, and a US $3 billion rapid repair contingency fund sourced from those frozen asset coupons designed to be released within 72 hours of a verified attack.
And political backsliding, like that July 2025 incident with MBU that caused so much concern.
Any such attempts to hobble the anti-corruption bodies will automatically pause EU facility disbursements. It essentially weaponizes the cash flow to defend institutional integrity. Donor fatigue, which is always a risk as headline crises fade, is countered by those public-facing dashboards showing tangible returns on solidarity, making the results visible. Climate volatility like drought or flood is addressed by crop insurance pools carrying a reinsurance layer for mechanisms like the African Risk Capacity and Gulf Sovereign Funds. Finally, cyber sabotage threatening the data digital backbone is mitigated by redundancy plans. That includes air-gapped clouds, completely offline secure data storage, and monthly failovers to secure data centers outside Ukraine, perhaps in Poland. So, by combining clear metrics, calibrated milestones, and these pre-committed mitigations, Ukraine aims to transform reconstruction from just a hopeful aspiration into a measurable, reviewable, and genuinely deliverable covenant. Precisely. The goal is that numbers become acts of praise. When year-end dashboards testify that corruption is retreating, engines are humming, and traumatized hearts are healing, they will hopefully echo the psalmist's boast. This is the law's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes.
This deep dive has truly laid bare the monumental effort ahead for Ukraine. From the immense physical damage to the really intricate financial and governance reforms required. It's a complex picture, certainly, but what really stands out is this holistic vision, one that tries to tie together economic strategy with ethical principles rooted in theology and community participation at every single level.
It certainly does. We've seen how this blueprint views the physical rebuilding, the grids, the silos, the conservatories, as important, yes, but ultimately as signs, not saviors. Their ultimate goal, as presented, is for families to thrive in peace, for communities to flourish, and for righteousness to characterize the nation. The path ahead is undeniably challenging, fraught with risks. But risk, as the sources themselves note, is the arena where faith can be proved genuine.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you consider what we've discussed today?
Maybe consider how these principles, stewardship, human dignity derived from the imago Dei, the balance of work and rest under Sabbath principles, might apply not just to a nation rebuilding from war, but perhaps to the recovery and growth needed in any community, maybe even in your own personal life or work. How might focusing on the ethical framework or fostering genuine character within your own circles of influence contribute to lasting fruitfulness, far beyond merely fixing what's obviously broken on the surface? Perhaps the greatest reconstruction always begins within.
A powerful thought to carry with you. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.